Welcome back to History They Buried, where the past is never truly dead, just hidden. Each day we unearth the forgotten, the covered up, and the unspeakable truths buried beneath everyday lives. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a warning. This is the macabre history of the Woolley family purification cult, and the children who were nearly sacrificed in the name of God. It began like many such stories do, with isolation, devotion, and a man who believed he alone could speak for God. They called him Brother Ezekiel Woolley. To the outside world, Ezekiel was a pious man, charismatic, soft-spoken, a self-proclaimed prophet who led his family and a handful of loyal followers into the barren Utah desert, far from the corrupting reach of modern society. But behind his weathered smile and scripture-laced sermons, Ezekiel was building something monstrous, a kingdom not of heaven, but of fear, control, dressed as prophecy. The Woolley family compound. A cluster of wooden buildings ringed by a crude fence and guarded by loyalty, not locks, was more prison than home. There was no electricity, no phones, no mail. The children were homeschooled, the women kept busy with chores and spiritual readings. Every moment of every day was controlled by Ezekiel's doctrine. And those who dared question him, they didn't stay long. Some vanished. Others were said to have fallen away and were never spoken of again. But one woman, Sister Sarah, Ezekiel's first wife and the mother of his eldest children, was beginning to see through the veil. She had been with him from the beginning, back when his words still felt like hope. But now, after years of watching his sermons grow darker and his eyes colder, something inside her had shifted, especially after what she heard through the cracks in the chapel walls. Ezekiel was preparing something, ritual. He called it the purification, a sacred act, he said, meant to cleanse their community of evil. But Sarah had lived long enough with Ezekiel to know, when he spoke of cleansing, it meant someone was going to bleed. And this time, it wasn't just another adult who had broken the rules. It was the children. The signs had been subtle at first, secret meetings between Ezekiel and the men after sunset, handwritten lists tucked into the folds of his Bible, strange packages arriving by wagon from the nearest town, candles, rope, white garments. Then came the whisperings, children waking from nightmares they couldn't explain, the younger wives avoiding eye contact, trembling after being summoned to Ezekiel's study. And finally, the breaking point, little Mary, only 9 years old, asking her mother what purification meant, because father said she'd find out soon. Before we continue with the story and unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel is not for everyone. Only the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers, and tell me in the comments what state you are listening from. Are you brave enough to hear a story like this from your own backyard? Ezekiel believed he was chosen, but in truth he was a predator disguised as a prophet, and soon the desert would echo not with hymns, but with screams. The Utah sun was ruthless that summer, baking the red earth until it cracked like old leather, drying the air until even the insects went silent. But inside the Woolley compound, it wasn't just heat that weighed heavy on the skin. It was dread. Sister Sarah had lived in that isolation for nearly 17 years, long enough to know the rhythm of Ezekiel's moods. He'd always been strict, always severe. But lately, something had changed. His words had become apocalyptic. His sermons, once filled with parables of hope, were now obsessed with sacrifice, cleansing, and divine punishment. The purification. That was the word that haunted her. He repeated it often, now like a chant. She'd heard it before, years back, when a young couple from Idaho had come to join the fold. A month later, they were gone. Ezekiel told the congregation they had been unclean. Their disappearance was God's will. Sarah hadn't asked questions then, but she would now. That night, as the others gathered for evening prayer, Sarah quietly slipped out the back of the chapel and made her way to the sleeping quarters. Her eldest, Ruth, just 13, was waiting, wide-eyed. "Mama," Ruth whispered, "he told Mary and Jacob to wear white tomorrow, said they would make Father proud." Mary's crying. She's scared. Sarah's stomach clenched. White garments were used in Ezekiel's blessings, ceremonies she had been kept from recently. Too old, he'd said, no longer pure. It was then that Sarah made her choice. She would risk everything. She would run. She had tried before, once, when Ruth was a baby, but she was caught before reaching the tree line. Ezekiel had tied her in the chapel for 3 days, reading scripture over her half-conscious body. The pain had been great, but what truly broke her was what came after, the way the other wives looked at her, as if she was the danger. But this time she wouldn't go alone. She gathered her 5 children, Ruth, Jacob, Mary, young Elias, and baby Hope, under the cover of night. They slipped from the sleeping quarters, each carrying only what they could hide beneath their clothes. The fence had a weak spot behind the goat shed. Sarah had spent weeks loosening the wood, just in case. They made it 10 feet beyond the fence before Ruth gasped. A figure stepped out from the shadows, lantern in hand. It was Brother Caleb, Ezekiel's nephew, loyal, brutal, but young. He looked at Sarah, then at the children. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded. "You know what he's planning. You know what purification means." Caleb hesitated. His jaw tightened. He looked back toward the chapel. Then, in a low voice, he said, "You have until sunrise. I never saw you." He dropped the lantern and turned back into the darkness. Sarah didn't wait. Next, we discover what happens when the woolly children finally reach civilization, and how the truth they carry will shock even seasoned investigators. They ran until their feet blistered and the stars began to fade. Sarah clutched baby Hope to her chest, her arms numb from the weight, her mind swimming in fear. The desert was vast and silent, but in her mind the voices still echoed. Ezekiel's sermons, Mary's whimpers, Ruth's terrified questions, and beneath all of it, the sound of fire crackling, purification. By dawn, the scrubland gave way to a dusty road. The family stumbled into view of a gas station, long closed, its windows boarded, and the pumps dry. But Sarah didn't care. She pounded on the glass until her knuckles bled. Her cries carried into the morning. A passing trucker saw them, slowed, hesitated, then pulled over. The man's name was Tom Briggs, a long-haul driver from Wyoming. He would later tell reporters he thought they were migrants at first, the children barefoot and filthy, the woman pale and skeletal with sunken eyes. But something in Sarah's desperation made him pause. She didn't ask for food, she didn't ask for water. The first words out of her mouth were, "Call the FBI, please, he's going to kill them." Briggs called local law enforcement. Within 45 minutes, a patrol car arrived, then an ambulance. The children were rushed to hospital. Sarah was taken into protective custody. At first, authorities weren't sure what to make of her story. Cults were not new in Utah, but most were harmless, eccentric pockets of isolationism. What Sarah described sounded like something out of an apocalyptic thriller. Ritual purification, locked chambers, sermons about cleansing the womb, girls marked with chalk, boys bound for fire. Detective Linda Hart, a 17-year veteran with the Utah State Bureau of Investigation, was assigned to the case. She expected trauma-induced paranoia, but when she interviewed Ruth, everything changed. The 13-year-old spoke clearly, emotionless, as if she had been waiting years. "Asked to say it all. He says the world is ending soon," Ruth said. "We have to be clean. Girls become clean by offering their bodies. Boys become clean by becoming fire." Linda asked her to explain. Ruth paused, then said flatly, "They take the girls into the upper room when they turn 12. Mama tried to stop it once. They locked her in the prayer closet. She didn't eat for 3 days. It was no longer a case of religious freedom or custody battles. This was criminal, possibly homicidal. The Woolley compound was placed under immediate surveillance, but by the time law enforcement mobilized a tactical team to move in, it was too late. The chapel was ash, still smoldering. 6 bodies were found, charred beyond recognition. Ezekiel Woolley was not among them, nor were 2 of the youngest wives. The ashes were still warm when investigators moved in. The main house had survived the blaze, though its windows were blackened and the porch sagged where the fire had tried to leap from the chapel. The air was thick with soot and silence. No children's laughter, no hymn singing, just ruin. And behind it, the lingering question, where was Ezekiel Woolley? Inside the house, the team expected debris. What they didn't expect was order. The living room was untouched, chairs neatly aligned, oil lamps still full. In the kitchen, plates were stacked, food partially prepped on the table, bread dough now hardened with time. It was as if someone had prepared for dinner and then walked away forever. Then they reached the study, a back room off the hallway, locked from the inside. When officers broke down the door, what they found didn't resemble the space of a man in hiding. It looked more like a shrine. One wall was covered entirely in red chalk drawings, symbols, passages from Revelation, crude depictions of flames consuming stick figures. In the center, scrawled in jagged lettering, "Only the purified rise." Below the writing sat a heavy wooden desk. Inside its top drawer was a leather-bound journal tied shut with red twine. The first few pages were clean, almost meticulous, the handwriting precise, poetic. But by the halfway point, it deteriorated into rants, barely legible, with smeared ink and frantic underlining. The journal began like a spiritual memoir. Ezekiel wrote of dreams that began in 1994, visions of fire and angels, of the earth splitting in 2. He claimed he was chosen to lead a flock out of the sin of modernity. He described Mary, his first wife, as the vessel who bore the first lamb. He spoke of his children not as sons and daughters, but as disciples born into the heat. And then the shift came. Around page 60, he introduced a new tier, the womb flame. According to Ezekiel, young girls became tempted by the devil at puberty. To prevent this, they needed to be purified through offering. He detailed rituals, unspeakable acts disguised as sacred tradition, and worse still, he claimed, the boys must be burned, lest they carry the seed of rebellion. The journal was not just confession, it was a doctrine. The final pages included a detailed list of names, birth dates, and a column titled Purification Date. Most names were crossed out. Detective Hart recognized a few immediately, including Mary and at least 3 children who were found dead in the fire. But then she saw something that made her skin crawl. 2 names were circled, Ruth and Hope, and beside them, under purification date, the words, pending escape, to be reclaimed. This wasn't over. Ezekiel hadn't vanished into flame. He had fled, and he still believed the ritual incomplete. The FBI issued a nationwide manhunt. But Ezekiel Woolley was already 2 steps ahead. Next, we follow the manhunt and the chilling trail Ezekiel left behind in a Nevada ghost town. The FBI dubbed it Operation Prophet, a multi-agency hunt for Ezekiel Woolley that stretched across 5 states in just 3 days. His image, once reserved for grainy church flyers, now flickered across national news. Bearded, unblinking, and deeply wanted. The charges were severe: child endangerment, ritual homicide, arson, and conspiracy. But for Agent Denise Hart, it was personal. She'd seen those names circled in the journal. She knew this wasn't just a manhunt. It was a race to save the last of the Woolley children. And the trail was colder than the ashes he'd left behind. That was until a gas station attendant near Elko, Nevada reported something strange. A man matching Ezekiel's description had stopped in just before midnight. He didn't ask for fuel, only matches and a gallon of mineral oil. He spoke softly, barely above a whisper, and had 2 young girls in the back seat of his van. The attendant remembered the eerie way one of the girls stared straight ahead the entire time, unmoving, like she wasn't allowed to blink. By morning, the local sheriff had traced the van's direction, east, into the high desert, but the terrain was vast and the leads vanished quickly. That's when Hart had a hunch. She'd spent weeks studying the Woolly Doctrine. One phrase kept echoing from the journal. The Lord's flames shall rise again in the place of forgotten saints. To most, it sounded like religious rambling, but Hart remembered an abandoned Shaker settlement called Mercy Vale, a ghost town nearly 80 miles off the main road. Once home to a fire-worshipping sect in the 1800s, it had long since crumbled into folklore, but to Ezekiel, it may have seemed sacred. She was right. When agents arrived, the town was dead quiet. Buildings half collapsed, the chapel leaning like it might confess its own sins. And there, parked beneath the steeple, was a rusted white van. Inside, empty blankets, a Bible, a coil of red twine. No sign of Ezekiel or the girls. But then they heard it. The distant sound of singing. A voice, hoarse but melodic, drifting from a nearby mine shaft. Agents descended slowly, weapons drawn. The song grew clearer. And he shall cast the unclean into the pit, to cleanse them in holy flame. They found no Ezekiel, but they found signs. Candle wax puddled around makeshift altars, small handprints on the dusty walls, and on one crude wooden beam carved deeply into the grain. Ruth was here. He's coming back. It wasn't just a trail. It was a message. Ezekiel believed he still had time. He was playing cat and mouse. But the prey wasn't the FBI. It was his daughters. 2 days after the mine shaft discovery, a string of emergency calls poured into the local sheriff's office from a roadside motel outside Salt Lake City. A housekeeper had entered room 6A expecting the usual, unmade sheets and stale cigarette smoke. Instead, she found the room meticulously clean, but something was wrong. The Gideon Bible was left open, page torn at the corner and stained with something dark. At first, she assumed it was wine, but the iron tang in the air said otherwise. When agents arrived, they scanned the room, not for prints, but for patterns. The Woolly family didn't leave messes. They left scripture, symbols, and signals. This one was no different. Inside the open Bible, Ruth had drawn something with a child's shaky hand. A cross with 3 eyes above it, the same crude symbol found in her mother's prayer journal, and in the burned-out chapel in Missouri. It was part of the cult's hidden language, a way to mark the presence of the chosen. But then, hidden in the margins of the book of Ezekiel, a passage had been circled in red pen, "And I shall purge the rebels from among you, and them that transgress against me. I will bring them out of the land where they sojourn, but they shall not enter the land of Israel." Next to it, Ruth had written, "He says I'm not chosen, but I don't believe him." That one sentence struck Agent Hart like a blade. This wasn't just a frightened child scribbling in secret. It was an act of defiance, proof that one of Ezekiel's daughters, possibly the eldest, was beginning to break away from the doctrine, that she might be trying to sabotage her father's twisted mission from within. Forensic teams scoured the room. On the window pane, fogged by condensation, someone had pressed their fingers into the glass to form a word: help. But what chilled the room wasn't the message. It was the hand size. It was small, far smaller than Ruth's. That meant at least one younger child had been with her in the motel, a silent witness, possibly too indoctrinated to cry out. The motel clerk confirmed the room had been paid in cash. No cameras, no ID. But he remembered something odd. The man, who fit Ezekiel's description, had requested a room facing the sunrise. When asked why, he said simply, "We need the light to see what's inside us." Hart didn't sleep that night. She knew Ezekiel was getting bolder. He was no longer hiding in backwoods communes or mining towns. He was moving through the world in plain sight, testing how much attention he could draw without consequences. And Ruth was leaving a trail. A breadcrumb path, not for rescue, but perhaps for judgment. Next, we follow a break in the case, a single torn photograph discovered at a library donation box. Inside a battered donation box behind the Roosevelt Public Library, nestled between a stack of outdated encyclopedias and water-damaged children's books, was something no one could explain. A photograph, half of one to be precise, torn clean down the middle. A part-time librarian, sorting donations that morning, pulled it out, intending to throw it away, but something made her pause. It was the eyes. Even in black and white, they radiated unease. She handed it to police, and within hours, the FBI was on site. The photo showed 5 children, shoulder to shoulder in matching plain dresses, standing before a dilapidated church wall. There were no smiles, no warmth, just sunken eyes, scraped knees, and a heavy silence captured forever in still frame. One child was cut from the image. The tear went straight through where another figure had once stood. But it wasn't the missing person that haunted Agent Hart. It was the backdrop. Because pinned on the wall behind the children was that same cross with 3 eyes, drawn in charcoal, the symbol of Ezekiel. The library's donation bin had no surveillance, no donor logs, but there was one clue. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded red ink, barely visible unless held to light. "They sleep while he watches, but I don't." Hart felt it again. That same childlike handwriting from the motel Bible. It had to be Ruth. She was trying to communicate, but not with police. With someone else. Someone she believed might understand her message. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a coded confession. The photo was dated to January 13th, 2016. That date caused Hart's stomach to drop. It was the same day a fire had broken out in a Utah church on private farmland, a fire local authorities dismissed as an accident caused by faulty wiring, but now it looked like something far more deliberate. Hart pulled the e-file from cold archives and discovered another disturbing link. The fire was started using kerosene and salt, a purification method known in obscure cult rituals, specifically those mimicking Zadokite rites. Only a handful of religious fringe groups had ever used such methods, and Ezekiel Woolley was once loosely affiliated with one in the early 2000s, before he was excommunicated for extreme interpretations. That fire, Hart now believed, wasn't just an accident, it was a cleansing, a sacrifice. And those children, the ones in the photo, had watched it happen. But one at least had not obeyed. One had torn herself from the frame and left behind this piece for someone to find. The picture wasn't just a relic, it was a map, and Ruth was running out of time. The antique shop was easy to miss, a narrow corner lot wedged between a shuttered laundrette and a kebab takeaway, its signs sun-faded and crooked, yesterday's echoes. Most of the foot traffic in Croydon passed it by, unaware that among the chipped china dolls and rusting jewelry sat one of the darkest pieces of evidence in the Woolley investigation. It was a young couple, Claire and Dylan, who stumbled upon it. They'd recently moved into a Victorian fixer-upper nearby and were hunting for something quirky to decorate their lounge. Claire, a hobbyist collector of analog oddities, picked up an old shoebox of cassette tapes from the back shelf. They didn't realize what they'd bought until days later. One of the cassettes was unlabeled except for a smudge of black ink on the edge. Curious, Claire popped it into their dusty tape deck. The recording began with silence, hums, then a click, then breathing, and then a child's voice. At first it was barely audible, muffled, as though whispered through a blanket. The voice sounded young, female, around 12 or 13. She spoke in a rehearsed, rhythmic tone, like reciting scripture, but the words weren't from any Bible they'd ever heard. When the hand touches the wound, it must not tremble. When the eye sees fire, it must not look away. When the Father drinks, we all must fast. The tape went on for 11 minutes, most of it a recitation of strange mantras, some in English, others in a disjointed mix of Latin and what a forensic linguist later identified as Enochian, the so-called language of angels used in Renaissance occult rituals. But the final 60 seconds changed everything. The girl's voice broke from chant to confession. My name is Ruth. I am not holy. I watched what they did to Daniel. He didn't want the robe. He cried when they anointed him. He said the oil burned. Silence. The father said the fighting makes us clean. But Daniel wasn't dirty. He was just scared. The tape ended abruptly, as if someone had yanked it out mid-recording. Claire was so shaken she brought it to the police that same day. When Agent Hart listened to it, she didn't breathe the entire time. There was no doubt. This wasn't a staged artifact or prank. The patterns of speech, the distortion from the tape, even the breath hitching at moments of fear. It was too raw, too real. It was Ruth. She was still alive in 2017, a full year after the Utah fire. And more importantly, she was still trying to speak. That meant she wasn't silent. She was being silenced. Now Hart had two clues, the torn photo and the cassette. Both were left in public places. Both had hidden messages, and both suggested Ruth was not the only child left behind. Next, we dive into a horrifying letter discovered inside a hollowed-out hymn book. A letter signed not by Ruth, but by someone who called himself the Anointer. It arrived in a plain manila envelope, slid through the mail slot of the Croydon police station on a rainy Thursday morning. No return address, no postage, just the words, to Agent Hart, scribbled in a jagged, childish hand. Inside was a hymn book, worn leather cover, gilded page edges, the sort of thing you'd find in an old chapel choir stall, forgotten under decades of dust. But as soon as Agent Hart opened it, the hollowed-out core revealed something more disturbing, a folded letter, discolored by time, its ink faded to rust brown. The paper smelled of mildew, but the words inside burned. Dear Watcher of Wolves, you read this because you were meant to. Not all sheep stray on accident. Some run. The fire that cleanses does not ask for consent. The robe fits those chosen, not those who squirm. Ruth was always half in, half out. She trembled too much. But Daniel, oh Daniel, he was pure flame. He sang as he burned. You think we died in Utah? Fool. We shed that skin like a serpent in spring. The family still lives. The cleansing continues. And I will anoint again. The Anointer. Agent Hart reread the letter 4 times. Her hands trembled. This wasn't just a message. It was a threat. It was proof that the woolly ideology, long presumed dead in that cabin fire, had survived. It had spread. The chilling nickname, the Anointer, didn't appear in any of the original reports from Utah, not in the files, the testimonies, or the burned pages recovered from the farmhouse ruins. That meant this was new, a second wave, a resurrection. And whoever had written it knew exactly who Hart was. Watcher of Wolves wasn't just metaphor. It was a direct reference to her internal codename in the Bureau's cult monitoring division, something never made public. Someone was watching her. Inside the hollowed-out book, Hart also discovered a small scrap of fabric, coarse, brown and stained at the edges. Sewn into it with uneven red thread were 3 letters, R.D.W. Ruth, Daniel, Woolley. This wasn't nostalgia, this was a reawakening. Hart immediately ordered the book and letter into evidence, launching a multi-agency alert across Interpol and the FBI. But the damage had already been done. News leaked, tabloids spun theories, online forums caught fire. The Woolley name, once buried beneath ash, began to whisper its way back into the collective consciousness. A cult doesn't need numbers to survive, it only needs belief. And somewhere in the UK someone still believed. The fire began at 3:14 a.m. Locals in the quiet Cornish village of Morganporth were awoken by the low whine of sirens echoing off the cliffs. Thick black smoke rose from the old stone church of St. Dympna, a building that had stood for nearly 300 years. By sunrise, it was nothing but scorched rubble and twisted beams. A historical loss, they said. Tragic. Unexplained. But Agent Hart saw something no one else did. Within hours of the press release hitting the wires, she was already in her car, racing toward the scene. It wasn't just a gut feeling, it was the symbol. Etched in the ash on the altar stone, visible only under forensic light, was the same three-circle emblem the Woolley family used during their cleansing masses. 3 interconnected rings, like a child's drawing of the Holy Trinity, but in the Woolley theology it meant something else entirely. Body, blood, burnt offering. St. Dympna's church had no gas line, no faulty wiring, and no history of arson. The parish had been all but empty for years. The last known use? A private baptism just 2 nights prior. No guests, no witnesses, just 1 infant, and 2 adults who signed the guest book under the name James Miriam Shepherd, a surname that had never appeared on any parish registry. But Hart recognized the alias immediately. The Shepherds. That was the Woolley family's preferred code word for outsiders being led into the fold. And Miriam was the same name Ruth Woolley had claimed during her final interview in Utah, hours before the fire took her life. Or so they believed. Hart combed through local CCTV. In one grainy image, she caught a glimpse of a woman, hooded, long coat, walking briskly out of the church hours before the fire began. She held something bundled in her arms. Not a book, not a handbag, something wrapped in white cloth. That same night, police found a small animal carcass at Tidaltopan, the edge of the churchyard, scorched, half-buried, surrounded by 3 arranged stones. A ritual, a warning. Hart's heart sank. She'd seen that exact setup before, in the Woolleys' early initiation practices. It was a sign, a declaration. The first fire had been lit. Back in London, her inbox pinged, an anonymous email. Subject line, "Ashes know the way." Attached was a blurry photo of the St. Dympna altar taken before the fire. In it, a small object rested atop the stone, a handmade wooden crucifix, burnt on one end, shaped like a shepherd's staff. No fingerprints, no prints on the email either, just one line in the body of the message. Ruth was reborn in the sea, and Daniel walks the cliffs. Will you come see? For the first time in years, Hart felt fear. Because it wasn't just a message, it was an invitation. Next, we trace Hart's journey to the windswept cliffs of the Cornish coast, where an abandoned lighthouse holds the next horrifying clue to the family's return. It took Agent Hart less than 4 hours to reach the Cornish coast. The cliffs near Trevose Head were treacherous, jagged, steep, with violent winds that slapped against the rocks like a warning. Atop them stood a derelict structure, skeletal against the morning fog. The old Trevose lighthouse keeper's cottage, long decommissioned, left to rot after automated systems took over decades ago. But Hart wasn't here for the views. She was here because of the symbol, again. Etched into the decaying wood above the cottage's threshold, beneath layers of moss and salt, was the same triple-ringed emblem. Woolley territory, clear as day. The door wasn't locked. Inside it was as if time had been forgotten. Dust clung to the windows, bird feathers scattered the floor alongside candles burnt down to stubs, and on the wall, carved into the plaster, a message, scorched black with soot. Shepherds must guide the ash. Beneath it, arranged in a perfect circle on the stone floor, lay 6 pairs of children's shoes, each pair different, each perfectly cleaned, and in the center a baby's bonnet, stained faintly with what looked like dried seawater. Or blood. Hart swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She wasn't alone. A creak on the upper floor, too heavy for a bird, too slow for an animal. She climbed the stairs. The smell hit first, incense and rot. The top floor had once been a sleeping loft. Now it was a shrine. One wall was covered in pinned photographs, all of them children. Some color, some black and white, none older than 12, none smiling. At the center of the photos was a large faded image. Hart recognized it instantly. It was the original family portrait of the Woolleys, taken in 1991. The parents flanked by their 12 adopted children, all dressed in white, standing before an altar. But someone had drawn over the image. Thick red marker now cover. Read each of the children's eyes. A date had been scrawled beneath it in charcoal. Bumst. August. Reopening. Hart stepped back, phone shaking in her hand as she snapped a photo. And then she saw it. A journal half buried under a stack of hymn books. She flipped it open. Handwritten. Fresh ink. First page. We don't return. We rebirth. The flames were never meant to end us, just the weak among us. Daniel has walked through the sea. We have children again. We are almost whole. Hart froze. They weren't just reuniting. They were rebuilding. Downstairs, a gust of wind blew the door open. A figure stood just beyond it, not close enough to be seen clearly, but close enough to know they were watching. Cloaked. Still. The wind didn't move their robe. Hart blinked. Gone. Nothing but fog and the sound of waves below. Daniel Woolley should have died in 2003. That's what the fire report claimed. That's what the dental records confirmed. That's what every official file insisted after the inferno tore through the Woolley family's Arkansas compound. But Daniel wasn't in the house when it burned. He was somewhere else. And someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one noticed. When Agent Hart returned from the lighthouse, her first stop wasn't headquarters. It was a retired forensic analyst living near Truro. Malcolm Davies had processed thousands of scene reports in his day, but when shown the original 2003 autopsy photos of Daniel Woolley, he frowned. That's not a 12-year-old, he muttered. He tapped the femur measurements. Look. Pelvis angle, bone maturity. I'd place this subject at about 16, maybe 17, not 12. Hart blinked. You're sure? Dead certain. That boy wasn't Daniel. He was someone else entirely. So who was in the fire? And, more importantly, where had Daniel gone? Over the next 2 weeks, Hart pieced together a disturbing trail stretching from Oklahoma to Devon, England. It began with a foster home, Meadow Springs, that had quietly operated outside any official state oversight since 2004. A private religious refuge for displaced youth, funded by anonymous donors, led by a couple who claimed to be Reformed missionaries. But the photos told a different story. Children, dressed identically in cream robes, lined up before a burning altar in the woods. One child, no older than 5, bore a facial resemblance that made Hart's stomach lurch. The same sunken eyes, the same gaunt cheeks, the same woolly expression. Then came the testimonies. An anonymous call from a social worker in Devon had cracked the silence. She described a boy named Micah, found wandering near Dartmoor in 2018, malnourished, mute, and covered in ash. He only said one thing: Daniel speaks in fire. At first it sounded like trauma-induced delusion, but when shown old photos of the Woolley children, Micah pointed without hesitation to Daniel. That's the man in the tower, he whispered. Micah's case had been quietly buried after that, but Hart now knew what the Woolleys had done. They hadn't just staged Daniel's death, they'd anointed him. Daniel hadn't been a victim. He'd been the chosen successor. The new shepherd. The sightings grew more frequent from 2017 onwards. A tall man in coastal villages handing out hand-stitched prayer books. A stranger visiting isolated churches in Cornwall with 7 silent children trailing behind him. Always barefoot. Always around bonfire dates. Locals gave him a name. The Firewalker. And in every case, after he vanished, a child went missing. Next, we trace the origins of the rebirthing ritual Daniel now leads, and uncover the twisted theology that kept the cult alive for decades. By the time Agent Hart reached the small chapel on the edge of Dartmoor, a derelict Methodist relic surrounded by fog-thick moorland. She wasn't chasing shadows anymore. She was chasing scripture. Not the kind you find in holy books, but the kind rewritten, repurposed, and turned into doctrine by the Woolies. Inside the chapel, buried beneath floorboards warped from decades of damp, Hart uncovered a locked cedar chest. No fingerprints, but inside were 6 identical books, hand-bound, leather covers scorched at the edges, stitched with human hair, each one titled The Book of Purging. The text inside was handwritten, in ink so faint in places it looked like it had been written with blood. The pages weren't just theology, they were rituals. A twisted reinterpretation of biblical sacrifice, mixed with Old Testament cleansing rites, fire symbolism, and bizarre pseudoscience. At the heart of the doctrine was one core belief: children are born dirty. Only through purification can they be made vessels of the divine. Purification, according to the book, involved 3 stages: the silence, where the child was stripped of identity, no name, no family, no past. They were referred to only as ashlings, the trial of flame, a symbolic exposure to fire, not to harm, but to test. Those who screamed or cried were considered unready. The rebirth, a ritual held at the Tower of Dawn, likely the very lighthouse Hart had visited. Here, chosen children were renamed by the shepherd and given the mark of cleansing, a scarification on the left palm in the shape of a circle with 3 lines through it, like a burning wheel. The books were dated, the earliest 2002, the latest 2019, all of them signed at the end, D.W. Daniel Woolley. The chilling part wasn't just the content, it was how organized it all was. These weren't scribbles from a madman, they were structure, planned, rehearsed, and they described not just the how, but the when. Each year on the spring solstice, the book said, the shepherd must offer ash to the flame. 1 ashling taken, purified, and then returned to the fire. Agent Hart read that line 3 times, hoping she'd misunderstood. But the footnote was clear. For the flame must be fed once more, lest the corruption rise again. The Woolies hadn't just escaped justice, they'd institutionalized horror. Back at the station, a background analyst flagged something unusual. A girl named Isla, who vanished in 2020 near the Cornish coast, had once lived at Meadow Springs. Her last known photo showed a faded scar on her left palm, in the shape of a burning wheel. Isla's body was never found. But a week after her disappearance, a bonfire had been reported burning through the night on the cliffs near Port Wrinkle. Locals assumed it was a wild solstice celebration. Now Hart wasn't so sure. Her name was Eleanor, not the name she was born with, but the one she'd chosen the day she fled. For years, she'd existed in the cracks of society. No national insurance number, no fixed address, no digital footprint. Just a woman in her mid-30s who rented by cash and refused to be photographed. But after Agent Hart put out a quiet call to survivors and anyone with knowledge of the Woolies, someone, an old hostel owner in Leeds, called in a tip. Said a woman fitting Eleanor's description had been holed up in a room for over a year, curtains drawn, always looking over her shoulder. When Hart arrived, Eleanor answered the door without hesitation, as if she'd been waiting. But when Hart mentioned the name Daniel Woolley, Eleanor flinched so violently she knocked over a teacup. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but something older, something deeply conditioned. "I don't say his name," she whispered, eyes fixed on the floor. "If you say it, he knows where you are." Hart didn't push. She just let the silence fill the space, knowing that for cult survivors, pressure was poison. After a few long minutes, Eleanor began to speak. Not about Daniel, but about them. The family. "I was the 3rd girl brought to the house. They said I was lucky, that most people don't get chosen." She didn't cry. She didn't stumble. Her voice was almost too calm. Rehearsed, maybe. The calm of someone who had gone over the memories 1,000 times just to prove they were real. They took my name first, burned it, not literally, but they wrote it on paper, made me watch it burn, and told me I was reborn. She paused, then added coldly, "They called me Ember." Eleanor said the house had strict roles. Daniel was the shepherd, his wife Miriam the watcher, and the others, the elder children, were called Flames. They policed the young ones, reported any impurity, and led the hymns during trial nights. Eleanor described the trial of flame, not just fire, but darkness. The children were blindfolded and led one by one into the barn. They were told to walk toward the sound of the bell, a large iron thing salvaged from a ruined chapel. We were barefoot. The floor was covered in ash and bone fragments. If you cried or stumbled, they'd say the flame rejected you, and you'd be taken away for correction. Hart's knuckles tightened at that word. Correction. Eventually, Eleanor escaped, not by plan, but by accident. A failed locking mechanism, a moment alone near the woodpile, and then a sprint into the night. She'd never gone to police, because, she claimed, they don't understand people like us. They think we're crazy or complicit. Sometimes, both. When Hart asked about Isla, the girl with the scar, Eleanor said nothing for a long time. Then she nodded. She was supposed to be the last ash offering, but the fire wouldn't take her. Hart didn't understand. She screamed, Eleanor whispered. The real ones don't scream. And that, she explained, was the problem. Next, we uncover a sealed recording, left behind in a storm-damaged chapel, of Daniel Woolley preaching to his followers just days before his disappearance. What he said has never been made public. Until now. The tape had warped edges and a faint smell of mildew, the kind of scent you only find in places time forgot. It was discovered behind a false panel inside the remnants of a chapel 2 miles from the Woolley compound. The building had been hit by lightning in the late 90s and condemned, but storm chasers exploring the ruins stumbled on something that didn't belong, a box sealed with melted wax, marked only with the symbol of an eye inside a flame. Inside that box, a single cassette tape, labeled For When They Forget. It had been transferred digitally by forensic archivists, but until recently, no one had dared play it publicly. Agent Hart had listened to it once, in the dark, alone, and afterward, she left the room shaking. Not from the words, from the voice. Now for the first time, the sermon would be heard. The tape crackles. Then, silence. A breath. And finally, his voice. The voice of Daniel Woolley. My children, if this message is being heard by ears not of the blood, then the time of false witness is upon us. Let it be known, what the world calls madness is but memory unshackled. He continues slowly, deliberately. They will come for you with their science, their suits, and their soft hands. They will tell you you were abused, broken, brainwashed. But I say this, did the flames lie? Did the fire not speak when the wicked were turned to smoke? You heard the cries. You saw the ashes. You know the truth. The sermon spirals downward, deeper, darker. He speaks of the hollowing, a coming reckoning when only those who had walked through pain would survive. He praises his wife, Miriam of the Watchful Eye, for her loyalty, and then he says something that even hardened investigators found difficult to process. The last ash has not yet been thrown. The girl, Isla, she must burn, or the gate will open wide. And then, a final message, whispered, like a secret prayer. If this is the end, let the blood of the Ash children rise. One day they will return. One day they will rebuild. The tape ends. Eleanor, when played the recording, simply stared into the middle distance. He was already gone by then, she said. Not physically and mentally. His eyes looked human, but there was nothing left inside. For Agent Hart, the sermon posed a terrifying possibility. The cult may not have ended. It may have gone underground. And those raised under Daniel Woolley's fire may still believe, or worse, be waiting. The most chilling part. There were several more tapes mentioned in Daniel's sermon, hidden, scattered, protected. Only one had been found. When federal agents stormed the Woolley compound in April 1997, they expected a nightmare, but what they found, or rather didn't find, sent panic through every level of law enforcement. Of the 12 children registered to the Woolley name, only 7 were physically located on site. 5 children, aged between 6 and 16, were missing. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of escape, no recent footprints in the surrounding woodlands. They were simply gone. Some agents speculated they'd been hidden, smuggled out days before the raid. But the compound had been under 24-hour surveillance for over a week. No one had entered, no one had left. Eleanor Woolley, when interrogated, only offered one cryptic response.